Welcome, everybody. My name is Maria De La Cruz, and I'm the president at Headwaters Foundation for Justice. Our mission is to amplify the power of community to advance equity and justice. And in addition to our grant-making work, that looks like partnering with people like you, activists, donors, and other thought leaders in our community who are making a difference. I'm excited to turn it over to my colleague, Allison Heist, who's going to be introducing our panelists for this video.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Allison Heist, the program director at Headwaters Foundation, and welcome to this year's Virtual Giving Project panel. We're so happy to have you here as part of this gathering and hope that you're connecting with your friends, family, and community who are sharing this space with you today. I'm so excited to introduce 3 organizations to you. These are all grassroots leaders in our community who are working toward a more just and more equitable Minnesota. And they're going to share what they're about, what their hopes and dreams are, and how you can support them in this work.
I'm Habon Abdulle. I'm a researcher, activist. I consider myself a diaspora transnational person. I am the executive director of Ayada Leads. Our organization is a nonpartisan organization. We are focused on civic engagement and fair representation.
My name is Eli Stein. I use they, them pronouns. I am the lead organizer with ROC Minnesota. It stands for the Restaurant Opportunity Center of Minnesota. We're a local chapter of a national organization called ROC United. And our chapter here, our office here, really focuses and zones in on worker organizing.
I'm Chanida Phaengdara Potter. I use she, her, and I'm the executive director and community architect of the SEED project, which stands for Southeast Asian Diaspora Project.
What is the thing that makes your organization exist and flow and be? And how do you build power, right? So like, what are the things that you're doing? And maybe even tell us a little bit about like what your analysis is around the change that needs to happen and how your organization is building power to make that happen.
For us, it's really about self-determination. What is our self-determined futures for our communities, especially our Southeast Asian communities, and what that looks like in terms of shared liberation with other Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. When government agencies failed to do translations in a culturally appropriate manner and in an accessible way, we stepped in with our skills in design and storytelling to actually do the messaging in a way where communities understood it. So we did audio animation. We also created a toolkit around the myths, the facts, and of COVID-19. We have found ourselves in this kind of trajectory of learning how to use language in a way where our communities can understand how to be part of a movement. If the movement isn't big enough for even our grandmas, then we have a problem. What we're doing in real time is trying to practice transformative justice principles, right? So the idea of how do we stop the harm? Because of what had happened in the Chinatowns in the Bay Area, as well as New York, we've seen the last statistics was 115% increase in reported anti-Asian hate crimes. We're having the community conversations we need to have. We're also working with our Black organizers through Black Visions Collective and Reclaim the Block to try to rebuild and to recalibrate why we're here together, why we're in community with one another. We've been doing pod mapping exercises. So if you are aware of pod mapping, it's actually from Mia Mingus. So who is in your pod? Who do you call and contact when harm is done to you? And then doing that at the individual level, the community level, and also institutional level. And so we have been working with some of our community members around how do we build our pod?
I want to just name that I appreciate you sharing the context of the current climate in terms of both the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing pandemic of systemic racism and how it influences your work. So like also I invite Habon and Eli to like weave some of that in too, because I know it's very relevant to the strategies and the work that you're doing right now.
I guess I want to give a little bit of context for where we work, which is an industry that has, right before the pandemic, nearly 10% of the private sector workforce working in that industry, and just keeps growing and will continue to grow. You know, while we're about 10% of the workforce, we experience some of the highest rates of sexual harassment, some of the highest rates of wage theft, which not paying you the minimum wage, not offering you sick and safe time that's guaranteed by law, not paying you overtime when you work over 40 hours a week. Just before the pandemic, 10% of the workforce was around 13 million people. At the height of the closures that were, ordered in order to keep people safe and to slow the spread, we saw about 8 million people laid off of work. Understandings of the state of our industry, which is that some workers were actually making more on unemployment than they were working their jobs full time or even 60, overtime. So that was happening for some workers, and then workers that weren't able to access state benefits because of immigration status, who don't have social security numbers and can't access federal stimulus money, even though they pay taxes every year and are working. Some of the hardest working people in our economy weren't able to access those things and were basically left with nothing. And so I just want to name that, like, the question is around, what's the vision? And our vision is that people can work a job that they love and feed their families and spend time with their kids and not undergo the sort of trauma that has existed in really distinct ways this past year of having to choose between your physical safety, the safety of your family and your community, and paying for your essential needs.
The United States of America in general, but particularly Minnesota, has a rich tradition of welcoming immigrants. But what we have noticed is the immigrants and refugees from not European country are always left in the periphery of power, particularly when it comes to civic power or political power. Our work is focused to changing that power dynamic. We want to see a reflective democracy. And by that, what it means is to see our leaders, our political leaders, to reflect and mirror the people they represent. Organizing in general is community, power, and action. What we do is, and how we work with our trainees, our members, is we help them to turn their resources into the power they need. The way we do that is literally through storytelling and building intentional relationship, structure team, strategize, and act. In a short explanation, how to change the I into we. Oftentimes, when we work, women will come and tell us, I have experienced such and such a discrimination. I have experience of experiencing this barrier. And we tell them, tell us more of your story. And then how that story can be connected to somebody else's story.
The next question is, can you give us an example of a recent campaign or initiative? And that could also be a story of a person.
The campaign that I want to talk about is the Caribou Coffee campaign. Before the pandemic, we would walk from restaurant to restaurant with information about workers' rights, because what we were seeing is we worked super hard to pass earned sick and safe time and $15 minimum wages and anti-wage theft laws, but workers didn't know about them. In many instances, we had an earned sick and safe time policy in the city of Minneapolis now for years, and workers still don't know about having access to that. And that's workers from all walks of life, speaking all kinds of languages. And so we would go from restaurant to restaurant talking with workers, just letting them know about their rights and offering to continue that conversation if people were interested. One of our organizers was out probably 3 weeks before the closures that both the mayor in Minneapolis and the governor instituted around food service institutions. And she, right around March 16th in 2020, she called us and said, hey, like, my boss has said nothing about closures. I'm not sure if we are considered as coffee workers, essential workers. We've heard nothing about PPE or any kind of protective measures. I don't know if I should come to work. And further, I don't feel safe going to work, but I don't want to lose my job because I depend on it. It was like, I don't know what to do. I'm feeling scared. My boss isn't talking to me. And so we asked her, like, are there other people in your shop that are feeling the same way? And she said yes. And then we asked the question of, well, if this is happening in your shop, what's happening in other people's? And so she and a group of other workers really started contacting workers just through Facebook, like messaging direct people who they knew who maybe they covered a shift in another shop. They knew people's names, but didn't have a cell phone, didn't have an email. Eventually started just looking for people who say that their workplace is Caribou Coffee. And what we uncovered is that that story of I was absolutely a story of we. No one was getting information. In fact, during the shortages of hand sanitizer and cleaning products, people were having to go themselves to grocery stores to pick up cleaning products for the shop. And these were workers, right, who were still expected to work and were engaging with hundreds of people a day without any protection from the boss, and they're working minimum wage jobs. As that story of I became a story of we, many workers emerged as leaders and started articulating not only the things that they needed to feel safe at work during the pandemic, but the things that they needed before the pandemic.
We are doing a political ad campaign with our community members around abolition terms and transformative justice type of terms. So it's kind of like the ABCs of social justice. That initiative is revolved around helping our community members know how to use the words that are so complex, that come from complex concepts to them. Justice and other terms. Also, what is defund, what is militarization, all those things. Making those connections too with some of the stories that we have shared is around the village model of how we have always cared for each other. Typically there is a circle of leaders within the village that gather together, and then they talk about how do we hold each other accountable? What is the justice you need to feel safer about this? How do we resurface that and remind people that, abolition isn't a far away concept that we've never knew about, but that this is something we've done before in the past that just needs to be replaced with something that we're so conditioned in, right? The system of policing is something that we as refugees and immigrants are conditioned to believe that we needed to rely on, but really we didn't, and we haven't in the past. So we did a bunch of animated video clips around trying to reach more community members to actually complete the census. There is a huge disparity that the census had mentioned to us about how Southeast Asian community members were not filling them out. And a lot of that has to do with historical trauma, right? So we on our end is trying to address that trauma and trying to unpack how people need to see that this isn't about you filling up a form with government so that they can get more data from you, but this is about getting resources to our communities where it's needed, right?
this work requires community to show up, right, and be part of it, and folks to join in and be collectively engaged. And it also takes resources. It takes financial resources. Real talk. What do you want grant makers, donors, people contributing to your work? Like, what do you want them to know in terms of what it takes, resources, whatever? What would you want grant makers or donors to know about your work right now?
Since the pandemic, funders have had this reckoning, internal reckoning with themselves in terms of how do we actually operate from more of an equity lens? How do we actually get our communities resourced, the impacted communities resourced? And different institutions are moving along that reckoning a little bit faster than others. So I want to give my hat tip to Headwaters for also always being kind of in the front of the game with this. Yeah, so I would say one thing I want to name about our work is that organizing looks differently for us and for different communities, and to support that in however way makes sense, that's led by the communities. Secondly, build a relationship with your grantees, get to know them, help them also inform and shape the grant making process. I also think the more Gen Ops money that you can give, the better. Please don't make us get funding for specific programs, for specific initiatives, because we work from intersectional lens and we're not a single issue, none of us are single issue organizations. Funders, I believe, need to better understand that when you give us Gen Ops monies, it means that we can be flexible where funding needs to go. And lastly, acknowledging the systems that you come from, the nonprofit industrial complex and the white supremacy structures that you may operate from, and actually do something about it. So I think that those are kind of my direct asks with funders, and Headwaters has been really gracious to make this process easier and also to help us better fund where we need.
One is minority-led organizations, and whether it's women-led or LGBT community-led or African-American community-led organization or Muslim, we are not a monolith group. We are diverse within our own little going background, and we have a different needs, different necessity, and organizations that are led and by minorities do different work, use different strategies, and we need that to be seen as a work that needs to be valued. The second is we cannot be rigid as a scope. What I mean by that, COVID-19 and the killing of George Floyd and the presence of the military and law enforcement resurfaced past trauma within the Somali community. Really, we noticed the people and families who were demonstrating what we thought was PTSD. So there are times that we become flexible because of the necessity and the things that we are facing, like COVID and the uprising that happened in Minnesota. And I would love that to be taken into consideration when they are working with diverse community who are refugees and have a background that is totally different and in needing.
Those of us that are in communities who are actively building power, I think really understand that the only people who understand the stakes of the work that we're doing are the people who live inside of systems of oppression that put us in the crosshairs, and those are overlapping and people have different experiences inside of those. But I think that there's a pitfall if we don't fund organizations that are led by people who understand, like in our case, what it's like to work in a restaurant, and what the stakes are if we have an 8-year implementation of a $15 minimum wage instead of a 2-year, right? And I think in philanthropy and in movement, we can get caught up on symbolic wins that make people feel good, and those are really important. But if people don't understand the stakes of the impact of those, I don't believe we can trust them to make the important choices when it comes down to choice-making time.
There is this funny story on how we met with Headwaters. Years ago, we applied funding in another organization, and Maria De La Cruz was part of the reviewing committee, and she did site visit for that organization, and she was amazing in the sense of not only was a good listener, but then she said, please, this is my number, give me a call back. I want to talk to you and tell you the work we do, who we are, and Headwaters. The respect and the work that Headwaters does is totally different than other funders we have worked. And that is because I believe many of the leaders and staff their background is from the grassroots movement, and they do understand what it means, the work we do, and how important is the work we do. The only thing we oftentimes seek from grant writers and grant makers, we wanted them to also give us power. And Headwaters is doing that.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our Giving Project virtual panel. We hope that you're leaving today inspired and excited to support organizations like this through the Giving Project. And now you're going to have an opportunity to connect and discuss what you've heard and what you're thinking in the next few moments with those that are gathered with you in our virtual Giving Project gathering. So thank you so much for being a part of this, and stay tuned for ways to stay connected and to support the Giving Project.